Good evening. My name is Jim Snyder and I'm currently president of the Geological Society. Tonight we're going to talk about Hollidaysburg area cemeteries. First thing we're going to talk about is the Bcgs cemetery project, which started in 2007. Dawn Feathers piloted this committee, and we tried to get driving directions and GPS locations for every cemetery in the county. This is the first time I've talked about this cemetery, or Indian burial ground, I don't know which you want to call it. George McFarland, who was a judge and from Hollidaysburg and was going to run for governor of Pennsylvania in 1852, but he was killed in an accident. He wrote a paper that said that when the canal came around the end of Bald Hill, which is just down the road here, the canal dug up Indian graves and mounds. And he also mentioned that this is the canal here currently. Over here is Old Town Run. He mentioned Chief Frank of Old Town, Indian Village. So that means that the mounds were in this area. Old Town Run's in here, and in this area is where they don't know exactly where the Indian town, the village was, because it said where two streams meet. Well, if you go over there, there's two streams that meet in that area. Okay. So there's only a few cemeteries in Hollidaysburg, so I picked out some unusual cemeteries in the area, and my OCD, they're in alphabetical order. So we're going to begin with the Battle of Frankstown, which was June the 3rd, 1781. 17 men were killed and 5 were wounded. This is in on 764 by Bcgs, and the reason it's called the Battle of Frankstown, because in Revolutionary time, Frankstown was the center of the area, and a 10-mile district around that was called the Frankstown. So that's why this was called the Battle of Frankstown. And there's a monument there. The plaque's the monument's right along the road, and the bodies are still there. And in the 1850s, farmers were still plowing up their bones, because most of the Indian massacres, the people were massacred, but they were actually buried where they were killed. Okay. This is an unusual cemetery that not too many people know about. This is the Brush Mountain Cemetery. It's up on Magnolia Street. An eccentric Mr. Hearn, who built violins and wrote music, is buried there. Him and his brother. And there's a Delosier woman and an infant. Okay. They had it all set up. This is in the 1920s. There was a plot and everything. And from what I understand, some people were buried there and then dug up and moved someplace else because the Cemetery Association didn't follow through. And I believe this is owned now by the Altoona Diocese. Okay. This is a Conrad Claycomb grave, 1776 to 1861. This is his grave here, and it's down at Canoe Creek. It would be across the road from the old log house where they sold the bait. And if you stand at his grave, he could look down on his farm, his house. Okay. The county poorhouse, cemetery view. First burial was in 1848. There's no records. There was a fire in 1891, and when the state took over in 1941, the records from 1891 to 1940 are missing. The society has a list now of 495 graves from cemetery records, funeral homes, and newspapers. Okay. This is probably the oldest cemetery in the county. And I put all the names on there because most people know a cemetery, if it's on a farm, by the person that owns the farm when they grew up. Now, actually, the Denlinger was the first person that we know that was buried there. And then the Kasners owned it, and then the Brewer owned it. This is the cemetery that a ghost hunter friend of mine, we went up there, I think Steve was with us, and we doused it. There are 2 stones with 3 engravings, about 28 field stones, and after we doused it, we ended up with 50 burials. So there's about 20 graves that are unmarked. Okay. Green Lawn Cemetery. The first burials in 1905. The burials are about 1,600. Green Lawn is, as you can see, connected with St. Mary's Parish. This is a Catholic cemetery. Okay. The Holiday Cemetery view, the first burial was in August of 1781, and there's 45 stones. Now some of these cemeteries, you'll see, it says no stones, and that's where we have revisited all the records we can find to see if there's people buried there with no stones. Okay. This is the Holiday Grant Memorial and the Altoona Tribune, June 11th, 1921, where they dedicated it. And also in this article, if you read, it says there's not many people know that this was called Savage Gap. Okay. This is the DAR improvement plaque from 2016 that they put on the Holiday Cemetery. Okay. This is the Jackson Cemetery view. The first burial was in 1855. There are 14 stones and 3 people with no stones. And local people would probably know what these are. They're from the Portage Railroad. They set these holes are what they put the rails on. Okay. The lone grave of the Alleghenies. He was buried in 1905, and they moved his grave in 1930. This is right as you go up Old Crescent where the road splits. There's 2 stories. I think there's another slide. There's 2 stories. The first story is that 2 boys found him, and the other story was another man found him. But he was so badly decomposed because he hung himself, they think, or somebody killed him. They just cut the rope and dropped him in a hole. Whenever they went to put the other part, split the road, they had to move him, so they put him up on the bank. And the new sign that we saw, the Allegheny Portage Railroad put on. Okay. This is down on the end of Scotch Valley below here. It's called the Marquis Scheinfeld. There's the map, and this is where there's 3 stones. The first burial is 1849. Now I remember this when I was a kid. We used to spot deer, and there was a fence around it. I talked to 3 people. One of the men was Bill Ritchie, who actually lived. This is the old Ritchie farm, and he said, and the other 2 people, one was Dick Matthews. They said it probably 10 to 12 stones at one time. So the stones that are there are laying down. Okay. This is the McIntyre Cemetery. The first burial was 1848. There's 177 graves and 75 with no stones. And I was told, I saw a newspaper clipping where possibly some of the people with no stones, and there might be other ones, that Mr. McIntyre, if somebody that he knew needed a place to bury somebody and they didn't have a place to do it, that he would let them bury them in his cemetery. Okay. Presbyterian Cemetery. The first burial, I have 1778. That's from Jones. Was it Michael Moore that was killed? Michael or William? Michael, I believe.
I think it's William.
But he was shot right up here, and Jones says he's the first burial, although I don't know for sure. Find a grave listed at 6,000 burials. This is the old entrance, which is right down the road from us. Some other views. This is a place a lot of people go up there and have pictures taken on this. Next. This is the stone where the Presbyterian Church originally sat. It was organized in 1788, moved in 1838. At first, I believe it was a tent. Then around 1815 or 1818, there was a forest fire, and the church burnt down and they rebuilt it, but then later they moved into town in 1838. Okay. This is a Robeson family cemetery. First burial, 1826. There are 2 stones and 4 with no stones. This isn't far from where the Indian village was too. It's not. It overlooks Old Town Run. And this is in Frankstown Township. Okay. Old St. Mary Cemetery, formed in 1846. Again, there's not much information here because this is one that we haven't revisited. I don't even know exactly how many's buried there. Next. The new St. Mary Cemetery view. First burial was in 1917, a flu victim. I think it was a little girl. And this is Green Lawn was St. Michael's, and this is St. Mary's Cemetery. Okay. This is interesting. I don't know if you'd call it, I don't know the word. Anyhow, James Shirley was the first man hung in Pennsylvania, in Blair County. He killed his wife. He beat her to death with a hammer out near Lamersville. This is the article about him being hung. This is the Lamersville Cemetery, and right beside it, if you go out there, his obituary and his will said that he wanted buried under his favorite pear tree. There was supposed to be a fence put up, and it was supposed to be kept and everything. Well, what they did was they dug the hill out for Phil. I heard that Phil went to Claysburg where they used to retire tires. And there was an article, there was a piece in the paper about the boys would go out there and try to jump over James Shirley's grave so he couldn't grab you. Go ahead. This is a Union AME. First burial is 1835. 76 stones, 97 with no stones. And the Sons of the American Legion just took over this. Now Harriet Gaston, who was a colored teacher at the campus, is trying to get this on the Portage Railroad, or the Underground Railroad, with conjunction with the Portage Railroad. So it would be listed with the Underground Railroad. Okay? This is kind of funny. An unknown man's body found. I believe it was Mattern's Orchard. It says Norrie Hill on Gagesport. They don't know who he was. He had a bottle of laudanum in his hand, in his lap. And old Louis Burgoon took $12 out of the guy's pocket. Oh. And I guess it reeked so bad that he had to send it to the Treasury Department to be replaced. This was 1905. I don't have the clipping, but there was another man found in around 1905, 1906, somewhere where the stream goes through the golf course by the YMCA. One man had a bottle of laudanum and the other man had a bottle of booze, and they both were found, and they were buried on the site where they found them. Okay. This is a Walter Cemetery. I don't know if anybody knows the story of Duncansville. Duncan and Walter settled there, and as the town grew, they met on the bridge and flipped a coin. Well, Walter lost because it's called Duncansville. But this is the Walter Cemetery. The first burial was in 1824. There's 8 stones and 4 with no stones. And I believe there's about 3 or 4 veterans. No Revolutionary War, but I think there's a War of 1812 veteran buried there. It's in poor shape. Okay. Zion Lutheran Cemetery views. The first burial was in 1816, 853 with stones and 477 with no stones. And if you look here, this picture was probably taken in the 50s, and look at the difference. I tried to stand in the same place to take the picture to show how many stones have fallen over. I think what happens is when they put the stones in before, they didn't cement them. And they just set them, as it freezes and thaws, they slowly just push them up until they fall over. Okay. This is Blair County cemeteries that have been destroyed. The Baker, or called also the Allegheny Furnace in Altoona. The Battle of Frankstown. The Kipe Cemetery, that's down in Frankstown Township. It's 2 doors down from the old pheasant farm. The Duck Cemetery in Houston Township, that's across from the 8 Square Church and Chapel. The Faulkner, that's 2 graves that Archie Clark recorded in the 1930s, and they're just outside of Henrietta going towards Bedford. The Mock Moses is in Freedom Township. The Mock was in the Revolutionary War. He's buried there, and that cemetery was plowed over when they put a pipeline through. The Peck Cemetery, that's out in Martinsburg, where the Reliance feeds place is. It's in a field there. That goes back to 1824, and they pulled the stones out in the 50s. This is one of the cemeteries that Dawn and I found were missing. That we used Penn Pilot, and it was there in 48. In 58, it's gone. But then we found out in 1955, Gerald Helsel went and recorded them, so we got it down to 3 years when it was gone, and we found out that the owner moved the stones, and they're supposedly somewhere in Martinsburg's sidewalk or something. Okay. Relocated cemeteries. This one I just found. This is Conrad Brent. I don't know if there's anybody else with him. It's up Tanning Point, and they moved him about 1904, what had to be 1905, because that's when Rose Hill. I think this farm was flooded with the lake. Altoona, Tanning Point, the Hoover Cemetery in Houston Township. Now, 3 of the stones were moved to another cemetery, but this cemetery, and it's here again, it says Hoover, but when we researched for the Houston Township Cemetery book, there's not one Hoover buried there. The Hoovers that owned the farm were buried in other cemeteries. So this is another one that we're going to have to search deeds back to find out what families were there and see if they're not buried someplace else. The other story that goes with this, if you went to that cemetery and that was your relative, he would say, take the stone, it's your family. Middletown, that's between Martinsburg and Fredericksburg. It was a small village, early 1800s. The man's name was Livingston, supposedly an herbal doctor, and whenever he died, the village kind of diminished, and they moved him and his wife to the Mennonite Cemetery, which is also called Sam Hill. And Sam Hill got its name because all the men, the property that joined there, they're all named Samuel. And then the remainder of the men, the people from that cemetery, were taken to Deal's Crossroads. The Spang Cemetery, that's in Roaring Spring. It used to be called Spang Mills. They had their own cemetery in town, and in the 1890s when they opened the Greenlawn Cemetery in Roaring Spring, they moved these people up. Also, in the 1880s, a tree blew over in Roaring Spring, and there was 2 skeletons in the roots. So they got to researching, and here the one was a Revolutionary button. So they assumed, and through Jones, when Spang's mill was burned, Neff's mill. When Neff's mill was burned, there were 2 Indians killed and 2 settlers killed. Well, when Neff came back that the mill was burned down, the Indians were gone, but the 2 settlers were there. So they assumed that these 2 skeletons were the settlers, and they're buried in Roaring Spring, Greenlawn Cemetery. Down at the bottom, it's cut off. That's the Union Cemetery. It was in Altoona, 11th Avenue and 15th Street. As the town grew, they needed the space, so they moved the bodies to Fairview in 1858, except for one small section in the corner that was colored people. I don't know where they moved them, but I ran across articles in the early 1900s where if they found bones, they just threw them on the cart or whatever, and who knows where they went.
Oh.
Okay. This was an article that was in the paper, and to explain what happens here is we have so much trouble with like Fairview, Oak Ridge, Rose Hill, and in Pennsylvania, if you're a non-profit cemetery, if you're not a cemetery for profit, you're not allowed to touch your principal. So if you don't have burials, grave openings, or people paying perpetual care, there is no money. So that's what's happened to these cemeteries. Some of them could have money in the bank, but they're not allowed to touch it. Charlottesville, near Grazerville, Charlottesville Cemetery reformed, and they went through all this. And I went to all the meetings to see what was going on. They had a lawyer there, so they had to reform and start all over again. And I think now you might even have to have a realtor to sell the lots. But that's the problem with the cemeteries. They're so old that all the people paid perpetual care are gone. All right. This is a Pennsylvania cemetery law. It's called Historic Sites. In 1934, if a cemetery is over 100 years old and there has been no burials for 50 years, it becomes a historic site. And it's a misdemeanor. You're not even allowed to have a tombstone on your property. Okay. This is sad, but the location is in Blair County. A lady sent me these pictures. And this is a wall of somebody's yard. I tried to research these names, but if they're not in the cemeteries, it's pretty hard. And how many Smiths are there?
Can you tell us those names?
John Lawson, he died in 1852. Philip Smith And looks like he died on 22nd of November 1864. But yeah, this is somebody's wall. Okay. This program was made possible by the Blair County Genealogical Society Incorporated, Roller Holoth Memorial Library, and the Hollidaysburg Area Public Library.
And we're very grateful to you, Jim, for coming out today to let us record this so that the public can enjoy all of this information that you have. Usually at this point we have wild clapping, which I will insert here through the magic of technology. And also we usually have a question and answer time. And so do you have any extra little things you'd like to add? Or I have a question right here that people at home might have.
Go ahead.
So you were using some inside terminology. A couple times you said, now Jones said.
U.J. Jones's history was written about 1854. What he based it on was in Pennsylvania. I was surprised they had the foresight about 1840. They sent out a 12 or a 13 questionnaire to elderly people in the state, and the book is written by Sherman Day. It came out in 1844, and it's people that were born before the Revolutionary War. And it's online. Just Google Sherman Day. It's very interesting. It's the whole state. Since there was no Blair County in 1844, you have to look at Huntington and Bedford.
Could you spell Sherman Day for us?
It's SHERMANDAY.
Thank you.
Sherman Day.
Mm-hmm.
Now the paper that I talked about, George McFarland, and the Indian mounds, the cemetery, and Chief Frank, he turned his paper in too late. It was 1845. The book was written in 1844. There's also Edward Bell from Bellwood turned in a 20-page his answers to the 12 or 13 questions. We have it here. If there's Bell, McFarland, and there's like 3 or 4 other people that Hohenstein got. He recorded and retyped it.
And by here you mean?
At the Genealogical Society.
Which is where we are recording right now.
Correct.
Yeah.
Hohenstein number 638. That's the book number.
I have a question about telling us about what the earliest graves, how they were marked, what was the material for the markers, and kind of what happened up through the years. Such as flagstones, fieldstones.
Yeah, I had. They're in the family Bible. The Boylan brothers. They carved stones down in Bedford, and there was some kind of a brown stone that as it aged, it flaked off. Now they have something that you can paint on the top that seals it and keeps it from getting down and it flakes. The wife has a lamer stone in Geeseytown, and since I was a kid, the whole front of it's flaked off. There was granite and marble. I think the marble's the white one, and the acid rain seems to just eat it off. It deteriorates. But they used field stones, and sometimes there's no markings on it. I know when I went to the Lauer Cemetery, Sherman Dick, I couldn't read it, and it was just carved, and the stone was laying on the grounds. So I just carried it out into the cornfield to get a better light, so I could get a picture of it.
Now, there's a stone up in Presbyterian where somebody took a field stone and etched with a chisel or a knife or a screwdriver or something the woman's name and her date of death. Very crude but effective.
Yes, the oldest stone I've seen is 1807, and that was out in the Cove.
Wow.
And another question. I know you did some research on companies that sold monuments. I think there was one in Hollidaysburg. Can you comment on that?
There was 2. It was down beside Sorge's on Allegheny and Juniata Street. I don't remember the first person's name that had it, but the second man's name was Dublin Marble Works, because I did some research for the society for a lady. There's a stone in the Geeseytown Cemetery. It's Charles Swaney. There's an inscription on the stone, and then there's a line, and below it says Dublin. Well, on Ancestry and every place else, everybody said, "Oh, he was born in Dublin." So I had to go down and research, and then I did research on the Marble Works. So I posted on Find a Grave that the clipping newspaper ad for Dublin Marble Works is on his Find a Grave page that shows Dublin also, and it explains that he wasn't born in Dublin.
Okay. I've seen those up there.
And
I have a question. You talked about the old cemetery at the Hollidaysburg poorhouse or the state hospital. How many, can you estimate how many bodies are laid to rest there?
Well, 1848 to 1941, I would say maybe 800 to 900. We have 500 names now.
Wow.
I've never been up there to see how many depressions. They say you can see the depressions, and at one time those wooden stones. There must have been some type of records, because in 1928, 28 or 29, when Alto Rest opened, they dug up 3 veterans that were at the poorhouse, and they're in the veterans circle at Alto Rest. So there had to have been some records, unless they just picked a body.
cool.
You mentioned about the Walters family, the connection to the founding of Duncansville and the Walters, the graveyard. Do you know where, like Samuel Duncan, the namesake of Duncansville, do you know where he's laid to rest?
No, I never ran across that. That's something I'll have to look.
The one that won the bet?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, when I was doing some research, I believe I read that he actually left the area then, headed up to northwest Pennsylvania and settled in up there.
Okay.
So he won the bet, but I left anyway.
Well, it might be in the book Toss of a Coin.
That's
Yes, that's a centennial book for Duncansville.
If there are people who are watching this from home and they would like to learn more about these cemeteries, or if they think they have a relative in these cemeteries, or if they live near one of them and would like to know more specifically where they are, where can they find that information?
Well, you can email me at printer@bcgslibrary.org, or make a comment on our on the BCGS Genealogical Society Facebook page. There's also a Facebook page, PA Cemeteries. It's PA Cemeteries. You can go on there and ask questions.
Well, there's a Facebook page, Blair County Genealogy, run by Judy Banja.
Yes.
And that's a very common site for folks to go to, say, hey, where can I find so-and-so? There's over 1,000 members on that. Some of them are very skilled at looking up information. So keep that in mind.
And Blair County is a small county. So there's only about 220 cemeteries. Like Bedford has like 370. But Blair County is a small county.
So are there other things that we could learn from these cemeteries besides the facts that you told us today? Are there some things that we could learn about medical conditions or any kind of genealogical things?
One thing to keep in mind, when you go to a cemetery, usually, I know all my wife's family and my family are all buried in the same cemetery. If you go to the cemetery to look for somebody, take note of people around, because when the women get married, their name changes, but they're usually buried, in the same area.
That's cool to know. And of course, we cannot have a cemetery program without mentioning 2 of your favorite websites that you like people to know about.
Find a Grave and A Billion Graves. Maybe we'll do a Find a Grave program.
I think we should do a Find a Grave program. That might be enough.
A how-to. Yeah, it's free, so it's a good site.
We like free, and we like local things too.
It's one of the sites. Whenever what we do here at the Genealogical Society, we'll go in and photograph the stones, or if it's been copied already, that we take that list and we look at newspapers, funeral home records, church records, anything we can find to look for people that are buried with no stones. And one of the last places we look is Find a Grave, because relatives are prone to, they know somebody's buried there without a stone, they'll put it on Find a Grave. So that's one of the sources that we use when we're checking for people with no stones. Most people don't realize that most cemeteries have a minimum of 10% with no stones.
So 10% buried people that have no stones above them.
Correct.
Ah.
Sometimes a man will die first, he'll get a stone, and then when the wife dies, there's no stone. A lot of things or the whole family doesn't have money for stones. Town, I think, a third is without stones.
It's cool to think of.
Yes, it's kind of sad. That's one of the things that gets me, is to try and, you can't always, to find these people with no graves, with no stones. We're going to release a new book. It's going to be the Annis and Charlottesville Cemetery. It's going to be, we did the book in 2007, but we're going to mark it as revisited, because we got some church records on the Annis Cemetery, and there's like 400 or 500 people with no stones, once we compared the stones with the church records.
Wow.
So that's a book that we're going to be redoing. Also, the Hollidaysburg Lutheran Cemetery, that's going to be in a book. It's in the process of being proofed 2 or 3 times.
So when those books are available, how do people get access to them?
Well, they'll be on our website, and probably we'll announce them in the newspapers.
And then people can get them how?
Either you can order it through the website by PayPal, or you can stop here, or just if it's in the newspaper. If you don't use PayPal, send us a check at the cost of the book, and plus tax, and $4 for shipping and handling.
And that goes to the Blair County Genealogical Society and the research that its members do?
Yes.
Awesome.
Keeps the lights on.
That's very good. Jim, thank you again for a wonderful program. We're looking forward to anything else you might like to tell us in future. Do you have anything in mind right now?
Maybe find a grave.
I think
Maybe
Find
we
a
can do
Grave
it.
should definitely be the next
A
one.
lot of people maybe don't know how to use it, and how to link people. You can put my whole family's trees on there.
Really?
Yeah, because you can link the people together.
You link them on Find a Grave, and you
Yes.
have
When you go to a person's page, there's an ID, there's a member number, and that's like a social security number. And if you're a member, you go to edit, and then you put the parents' numbers in. And then once it's approved by whoever input that person, then they'll be linked.
So it'd be like you're virtually walking through that cemetery.
Correct.
From family member to family member.
Well, you can go to my dad's page, and down on the bottom is a picture of his parents and his wife. So if you click on his wife, it'll go to her parents.
And when you say picture, is that a picture of their stone?
Yeah, there's a picture of the stone. If for each person you can put each volunteer, you can put 5 items on a Facebook page. Usually the tombstone is first, and it'll ask you what type of information you're putting on there. So if it's a tombstone, it'll post it. It'll like pin it to the top. Then you can put pictures, obituaries, death certificates.
So people in other states, for instance, who couldn't access directly the actual cemetery can still find
Correct.
a lot of good information.
Yeah, and its ancestry is now owned by, Find a Grave is owned by Ancestry, and the man that started Find a Grave started building graves. It's a little bit harder to navigate. Don't you think so?
I just use Find a Grave.
Yeah, well, we try to use all the sources we can if we're looking for people with no stones.
Awesome. Well, Jim, if we keep talking, we're just going to fill this whole memory card up in this camera. So we better stop at a good spot. But last thing you would like to tell anybody about cemeteries of our area?
It's a shame how many have been destroyed and are not kept up. Stones falling over, and the Boy Scouts come and clean these places up, but years later they're gone.
Do you recommend that somebody could volunteer somewhere if they felt they wanted to help?
I don't know who you almost have to know whose cemetery what is. That's the Genealogical Society. The way we look at it, we don't have the manpower to go in and fix these cemeteries and straighten the stones up and things like that. So the least we can do is document what was there. So if anything does happen, like the Baker Cemetery, it's under the parking lot at the Altoona Mirror.
So if someone wanted to help, they could come to the Genealogical Society and say, I would like to help with the cemeteries.
Correct.
Oh, that's good to know. And they should probably email you at
printer@bcgslibrary.org.
All right, Jim, we're going to say goodbye. Thanks so much. Bye.